I'm very, very pleased to introduce my dear friend and colleague, Bill Torbert. Bill is one of the founders of the field we now call vertical development. And Bill is the scholar and practitioner who has done the most to connect the field of vertical development to the field of leadership development. You may have encountered the work of Bill's illustrious predecessors and contemporaries. Bill is part of a pantheon that includes Jean Piaget, remember him from Psych 101, Eric Erikson, Lawrence Kohlberg, and more recently, Bob Keegan and Suzanne Cook-Reuter are all part of this chain that's sometimes referred to as vertical, sometimes as constructive developmental theory. Bill's career includes 12 books by my counts, including this one. Bill can correct if that's not correct, as well as over 80 articles and chapters. His 2005 Harvard Business Review article titled 7 Transformations of Leadership was rated by HBR as among their top 10 leadership articles of all time. His list of honors and awards is long, and I refer you to his website. Bill has taught at Yale, at Southern Methodist University, Harvard, and for over 30 years, Bill was the graduate dean for the Carroll School of Management at Boston College. Bill was instrumental in the founding of the organizational leadership practice at the Center for Creative Leadership, and in 2013 was awarded the CCL Walt Ulmer Award for career contributions to applied leadership research. When we started that practice, the word transformation was practically forbidden. Clients did not want to transform. They simply wanted to improve. And so Bill was far ahead of his time. And now in our disrupted world, the goal of transformation is in great demand. Bill is the co-founder of Global Leadership Associates, our host today. The things that GLA does, including the Global Leadership Profile and Transformations Card Deck. So Bill is here today to discuss his newest book, Numbskull and the Theater of Inquiry, Transforming Self, Friends, Organizations, and Social Science. This is a memoir, and yet it's more than a memoir. Numbskull is a rethinking of the nature of science, social science in particular, and it challenges us to take a scientific approach in this broader sense to all the actions in our lives. Numbskull is an invitation to collaborative developmental action inquiry, or as we like to call it, action inquiry. Welcome, Bill. Thanks for joining us.
Thank you, Chuck. And it's lovely to be presenting and engaging in conversation here with my close friends, Sarah and Chuck. And the book itself is a product of many people's work, many friends' work, and includes the foreword by Chuck and a set of stories in the postscript, developmental stories by Aftab Irfan, another member of our community of inquiry, and indeed the introductions and the endnotes are all co-created with a number of community members. The book is not, as Chuck said, just a memoir, but includes second-person stories and assessments of me by other people, not always entirely comfortable for me, but that is the nature of action inquiry. One receives all kinds of feedback that one didn't know one needed. The appendices are really in a third-person mode, and give more access to the theories that I developed across my whole career and which have never been brought together in one place before. But the ultimate point I hope this book will make, although hopefully through the memoir it will help people look at their own development, and through its leadership stories will help people with leadership, through its organizational transformation stories will help teams and organizations and consultants know how to support transformation. But my main interest is in getting social action and social science to recognize that each is absolutely dependent on the other to make a real science for the future. And one aspect of how different this science is from existing science is that it's not only an attempt to create true generalizations, but to go beyond that to knowledge that permits us to act in a timely way. So the aim is not an all-encompassing map of the universe, although that is a subpart of the aim, but is to go beyond generalization to the very specific situations we find ourselves in, the unique situations, and how I can apply all my knowledge to the present moment, and how I can be seeking more knowledge in the present, be partially empty to what's new about the present, which of course I will want to respond to if I want to be truly effective. And in order for this science to exist, it has to include not only research on the past, like empirical science, but as research on the present, and even, paradoxical as it seems, research on the future, research on the volume of possibilities. And so these are quite different methods or objectives than current third-person science has. And rather than just trying to triangulate among empirical methods, usually it's said that if you can get 3 different empirical methods to surround an issue that you are trying to understand, that you can triangulate your way toward the truth. In the action inquiry version of social science, you have to triangulate among your third-person measures, among your second-person feedbacks that are occurring as you are acting, and your first-person awareness. All those 3 have to be mutually modifying one another rather than mutually isolated from one another. So we're hoping that people will recognize that this book is unusual, not only in espousing that content, but also in the way it's organized. So in the introduction, the reader is invited to choose where he or she wants to start in the book. And there are a number of different, quite logical places one might want to start. One might want to make the postscript by Aftab Irfan into a prescript, and thus be able to hear about the development of a young Middle Eastern woman that is offset against my old white male autobiography. So it gives more people access, hopefully, to the developmental process and the developmental ideas. Or you could start with the appendix, Appendix A, where you get a summary of all of my theoretical work. For some people, that might be the best choice. And others will simply start with the memoir in chapter 1. So I think that gives a very big overview of the book. And we now want to go on to have Chuck read a single episode from the memoir part and suggest how you all can reflect on it over the next minutes when we create a breakout set of breakout groups in just a few minutes. Chuck?
Yeah, thanks, Bill. So I'm going to read a story from the book, and it's one of these stories that's not necessarily flattering to Bill, but it's a funny story, and he included it, and I'm glad he did. And it's from his adolescence. And after I read the story, we're gonna go into breakout groups, and I'm gonna ask you to think of a story from your own youth, maybe adolescence or around then, that has some sort of, let's say, mythic resonance for you. After all these years, it contains something important, even though maybe it was from a more primitive spot in your life, that it remains important. So put that in the back of your mind and just listen to this story. Okay, Bill, here I go. I'll try to do it justice in your voice if I can. So it starts with Bill talking about his experience in Cub Scouts and then Boy Scouts. And Boy Scouts wasn't so compelling for a number of reasons. But then they started doing interesting things, and here's where it picks up. But then a plan was announced for the troop to build a permanent winter encampment in the countryside near Washington. This sounded like a serious adult project to me, and I was eager to participate. When we arrived at the spot and surveyed the land, it became evident that we needed a bridge. We needed to bridge the creek and build on the other side where we could see quite a lot of fallen wood. A tree had already lying across the creek offered a start. Someone needed to carry one end of a rope to the other side to tie to other fallen logs so that they could be pulled into place alongside the first one to make a bridge. I immediately volunteered in order to demonstrate my good balance. A little foreshadowing here. Obviously, my aim of demonstrating my balance could be best accomplished by walking across the log rather than by inching my way on all fours. An even better demonstration would be to keep my hands inside my pockets rather than holding them out at my sides as though there was some difficulty about keeping my balance. Following this logic without hesitation, I reached the midpoint of the log without any difficulty. But here, my idiosyncratic strategizing took me in an even more unconventional direction. The apparent likelihood was that I would reach the far bank without mishap. Nonetheless, I realized that my nonchalant posture would make any misstep all the more ignominious, and that the only sure way to avoid mishap was, okay, wait for it, folks, to intentionally dive into the creek. Therefore, once again, following my newest calculation without hesitation, I turned 90 degrees and calmly dove into the creek, hands still in pockets. Naturally, my head was the first to hit the rock sticking out of the freezing water. So I was both shivering and bleeding profusely as I emerged from the water to announce nonchalantly that I had created the perfect opportunity for the troop to practice making a stretcher. Way to go, Bill. Next, I collapsed into involuntary shivering and shuddering. Soon, though, the troop had me on a newly constructed stretcher and in the back of a station wagon. A few hours later, I had a new set of stitches in the front of my head, as well as something of a dent that's lasted to this day, which my three sons now politely refer to as the Grand Canyon. End of story. Okay, and one of the nice features of the book is that there are endnotes that reflect on the stories. And as Bill said, you know, some of the material, the footnotes and the endnotes is about others critiquing. Some of it is analytical in nature. So, Bill, I'm going to read from the endnotes. Excuse me while I pull it up here. Okay, here is the endnote in which Bill is reflecting on this story. So during this period in Washington, it is worth noting one particular event that illustrates how a given action may interweave several different action logics. When Torbert is crossing the stream on a log at Boy Scout camp and dives onto his head, one can see a full house of action logics intermingling with one another. So they're not necessarily one at a time or all in line. You know, here we see a full house of action logics intermingling. There is a strong element of the impulsive numbskull. There's an element of the boastful opportunist, wanting to be first and best in terms of a physical skill. There's an element of the diplomat, wanting others' positive regard. And there's even an element of the expert trying to show he knows the right thing to do when he scrambles out of the stream and announces the troops should practice new skills and build a stretcher for him. Okay, so I was part of the workshops developing this book, and they were fascinating. And Bill would invite us to read a chapter and then reflect on our own experience. And so the chapter was an earlier one that was introducing the impulsive and opportunist action logics especially. And Bill invited us to think back on a time when maybe we were impulsive or opportunist. And, you know, we often have the stereotype that those are not useful action logics, that they have not much to offer us, and we better just grow out of those as soon as we can. And so I thought of my own, which I'll just relate in the briefest form here, and while inviting you to do something similar to your own stories. So I thought, and I said, you know, there's this story that feels important to me, and it keeps recircling in my brain, but I don't have anything to attach it to. It just seems like kind of a dumb thing I did when I was a kid. And then as I narrated the story, I realized that it said an awful lot about me and that I was kind of proud of the story after all. And it basically involves us playing as little kids, probably the same age as you, Bill, roughly. Oh, I don't know, 11-ish, maybe. Maybe
Right.
I was a little younger than you were, but we were playing in the woods. You know, we had awesome freedom when I was growing up. Mom just said, go play in the woods. And we did. And so we quickly discovered deep in the woods what we called the air shaft. And it was a huge thing. It was like 12 feet in diameter and about 8 feet high. And we had to find a fallen log, another log in the story, interesting, to climb up on the air shaft. And when we get up there, clinging to the edge, there was a metal grate all the way across it. But we dare not really go out onto the middle of the grate because it was just frightening because, you know, imagine a 12-foot in diameter hole in the earth that went down as far as you can imagine. And we couldn't see actually because it was dark. So we said, aha, we can't see the bottom. So what would any self-respecting, I was a Boy Scout then too, you know, what would any self-respecting Boy Scout do? Well, just what we did. We went home and we created Molotov cocktails of gasoline and stuffed with rags and brought them back to the air shaft and said, we're going to get to the bottom of this. And so we lit one or two and dropped them down. And my goodness, it was very, 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 very deep. And I now know, because there's actually kind of a historical monument there, that it's a football field deep. And at the bottom, we can see the gasoline burning. Now, as I later found out, that air shaft was built as a life-saving device to get air into a mine because in I think it was 1908, 111 miners died in this mine. It was being ventilated by this shaft. The shaft came later. They died from methane suffocation. And so now I look back and think, you know, there's something almost spiritual about this, that at the end of the day, we were being bold and there's an element of, I don't know, communicating or recognizing the spirits of the dead at the bottom. And, you know, we were a little bit lucky because if you think about it, if the shaft was really meant to vent methane, we were dropping flaming gasoline into methane. That might have been not a great thing, but we escaped. So that's my story. What's your story? And you can, of course, as always, exercise self-discretion in sharing any of your stories. You don't have to share a story. You're welcome to just listen to other stories if you don't have one. But something in your earlier life that's maybe impulsive or opportunistic, that somehow has a mythic resonance that you maybe haven't fully processed. And we're going to share these in the breakout rooms of, it'll either be 3 or 4 people. You'll have 15 minutes. Take just a couple minutes hearing from your experiences in the breakout groups. Not everyone has to report out, obviously, but if you have any stories to tell from your group, and of course, don't tell anyone else's story without permission. But that being the case, love to hear any insights you have about the mythic resonances of early stories that otherwise seem impulsive or opportunistic. And Sarah, what's the best way to do this for people maybe just to speak, or is there a hand raising?
Either or, you can either pop a comment in the chat, or if you want to unmute yourself and chip in, that'd be great.
Yeah, just go ahead and unmute yourself.
Hello?
Hi, I'm on the phone. Thank you.
Yeah, Bob Rischke here.
Hi, Rob.
My partner and I talked about, shared a couple of stories, but I think one of the things that was interesting was this idea of taking an early story and bringing it into consciousness and thinking about it, and thinking about the experience and the impact of the experience and relating it to where we are now. This making it more conscious and intentional was just an interesting conversation to go through. We didn't get a chance to really explore the connection to any kind of action logic that was present, although we did sort of see some elements of opportunistic, particularly in my story, which was more about bullying and being bullied in my early adolescence. But just making a story that is impactful, right, raising it to consciousness and thinking about it was really interesting.
Yes, very good.
Yeah.
Thank you, Robert.
When I began writing, I was writing incidents from my early life without any thought that I would ever analyze them in a developmental sense. So it was very useful then come back later and try to see if there was any meaningful sequence in the stories. And indeed, it turned out, maybe because I could only see that, being who I am, that yes, my life went through the very developmental stages that I was theorizing about. How convenient, but very interesting. And in some cases, really reassuring, because some of the things that I found I had done as a kid that I was most conscience stricken about usually turned out to be things I did at the cusp between one action logic and a next, so that in fact my later action logic was able to critically look at the event and self-criticize, but it was not strong enough yet to actually influence my action. The earlier action logic had influenced the action. So that was an interesting thing to find. It'd be interesting if one or two more of you would like to share.
So Michael and I had a great conversation about he had some fantastic stories. But we talked about this theme of kind of feeling that we could do anything, right? And kind of being aware of rules and limitations, but not orienting toward them, orienting toward, what was fun or different that we wanted to do. And so just kind of wondering, like, was that something that can be developed? Is that more of an orientation that we shared? Sorry for the background noise, but so that was the kind of wondering for us, the connection at the end to the action logics and what does it mean, but remembering that sense of kind of freedom and kind of opportunistic sort of tuning down the risk part and tuning up the opportunity part.
Mm-hmm.
Nice to see you, Michael.
Good to see you, Jack.
I can happily share my partner's embarrassing story. No, I'm just kidding. No, what came from ours was this, beyond the surfacing of it, we started talking about how we were remembering it now and how we were, in particular, how we were constructing it now, and recognizing the way that I, in particular, was conveying the memory was also reconstructing it yet again. And as we shared each of ours, having just a little bit of a different theme, his theme helped me see things that I had forgotten, or that I decided to bake into it. I don't know. But I mean, it was this conversation that triggered, in particular, there was a theme of distance for me, and there was a theme of embarrassment for him, and this embarrassment made me think again about what I was becoming distant from, and it was partially an embarrassment, and I had forgotten that. So there's really power in the way that rolls out.
Yeah, thanks, Patrick. Nice to see you.
Shall we go ahead to the next portion?
So just a quick comment, Bill. I hope it's quick. So this is just reminding me that, gosh, in all my experience doing this kind of work, I will say that one of the most powerful things you can do in a classroom or in a coaching situation is what we call life journey storytelling. And that's why we invented the transformation cards. If you've seen them, they're just cards with prompts on them, and you could put them in some sort of order for your life story, from past to present and even to future. And we made the cards so that they weren't immediately recognizable in terms of the action logics, because we just wanted to sort of get that out of the way for a bit and just have people tell stories. And man, that is just so powerful for people to reach back. And we can suggest, various places to reach back to. You have to be a little careful, because sometimes people reach back for something that's kind of horrible in their lives. You have to be careful with that, but just a powerful thing to do. And all the things that you guys have been saying, the resonance with each other, the bringing it up into consciousness for reflection. You don't have to instruct people, they just know how to do that. So yes, Bill, sorry for the interruption. Let's go to the next part.
Oh, great. Well, we wanted to talk a little bit about another incident from the book. It's too long to read, so I'll try to retell it briefly. It's from the time just after I was in college that in a bizarre twist of events, I became the founder and director of the Yale Upward Bound program, which was a war on poverty program in the late 60s. And we had 60 New Haven students, and 2/3 of the students and 2/3 of the faculty were Black. And of course, the students were from backgrounds of poverty. And most of them were being thrown out of school every Monday when they reappeared, because the assistant principal found that less bothersome to the rest of the students than having to kick them out after they'd committed yet another antisocial act. So they had average grade point average of about D, and average reading level of grade 2 when they were going into grade 10. We decided to take them out to the country for the first week of the program, to a camp that Yale had next to a lake, and that we would invent the school during that week. We would create a constitution for the school in group meetings, and then the separate classes would break out and take different parts of the problem and work on them and come back the next day. It was crazy the first few days. The kids didn't seem to want to go to sleep at night. The girls were no less excited about inviting the boys into their cabins than the boys were excited about trying to maraud. And when we had meetings in the morning, everybody was shouting. It was impossible to hear yourself think or hear anybody else speak. But very gradually over the 3 days, a sense of increasing willingness to listen to one another. Of course, these students had never been involved in trying to make collaborative decisions and actually believe that they had the power, which resulted, among other things, in a discipline committee that consisted of 10 students and 5 faculty. And of course, also a daily schedule. They were astonished that they could participate in making all those decisions. And on Thursday afternoon, I went into New Haven to get the checks for the staff who had been up almost continuously and were going to very much enjoy a weekend off. The program students went home on Friday nights and returned on Sunday evenings, and came back. And to my surprise, found all the students in very dark and somber mood outside the dining facility, whereas usually at that time of the afternoon, they would be down at the lake, and no faculty in sight whatsoever. They were all inside the dining room, and it turned out there had been a fight between some of the students and some of the staff when the staff members tried to prevent the boys from harming the girls. And I came in, and of course, I didn't know anything at the outset. And there was this very bitter conversation going on between those staff members who thought that the students needed to be thrown out of the school immediately because of the disrespect for authority, and other staff members who said, no, we don't have any rules yet at this school. So it would be completely, we're in a state of nature, and we ought to use this as an opportunity to make some rules, like no fighting. And what's more, it wasn't clear to some of the staff that the students had started the fight. And after I got my courage up and realized I wasn't the only one who seemed to be unclear as to what had happened, and I asked for a quick review, it became evident that it was actually a faculty member who had started the fight by pushing a student away from a girl. This was a woman staff member. All the participants in this, students and staff, were Black. And so we did not have a sort of interracial tension situation at this point. So I very quickly sent out a few staff to just talk with the students outside. And then one of the other staff said, look, I'll make a little speech and I'm going to take out all the staff and the students who were involved in the fight, and we're going to come do some peacemaking by ourselves outside. And so I and another member of the staff on the spot were making these decisions, which were not collaborative decisions, unlike all the work the rest of the week. They were, in a sense, unilateral decisions, but they were on behalf of a longer range collaborative relationship. And up until that time, I had been a tremendous advocate of collaboration, with a sense that collaboration was good and any form of unilateral power was bad. And I now realized, not at the time because it was too much in the action, but soon afterwards, that what turned out to be an extremely successful reconciliation with the small group of people going outside and coming back to say that they had shaken hands, which nobody had believed would occur, and the rest of the staff and students hustling around trying to get supper ready because it was already late, getting into the evening. And so there was a sense of sort of making a true first rule that there could be no fighting and between faculty and students, and there never was, again, the rest of the summer. So, and I might punctuate that story by saying that a year later, in 1968, when we again had the program, and most of the students were from the previous summer, or half of them were, and about half of the faculty was from the previous summer. And we had agreed during the year that the faculty should take control of the discipline committee, not because the discipline committee hadn't worked the first summer, but because the students felt that they could now trust the faculty and they could spend more time on actual work. But what we didn't take into account adequately was that half of the school had not experienced that history. And because this was the spring after MLK and then RFK were assassinated, and the spring of Black Power, I became White Devil in the second summer to some of our students and staff. And there was another fight, not a physical fight, at the end of the first week of the second summer, but it pitched me as the director of the program against one of the Black students who claimed to represent all of the Black students, who was saying that the discipline committee was unfair and unconstitutional because they had just made a decision to ask two of the students to stay away from the school 2 days of the next week because of their behavior. And in that case, I wasn't able to find a way of rallying the troops into a shared vision. It became very divisive for the whole rest of the summer. So I actually succeeded the first time and failed the second time but the conditions were different. You had an interracial dispute the second time in a really hot climate. So I'm sharing that story as an example of a process of moving from the redefining action logic toward the transforming action logic, where redefining becomes quite ideological about things like collaboration, because nobody has the right to impose anything on anybody else because we have different worldviews and you can't prove yours is right, to a transforming action logic where you realize that there can be transformation that is voluntary among people, and only through mutual power can that be accomplished. So those were early years of my attempts to move towards a true transforming point of view. And what we wanted to do was to open the process now to questions of any sort about what we've talked about or about parts of the book we haven't talked about. Chuck, do you want to make any comments before we?
So feel free to just open your mic and start chatting, or you could put something in the chat box. While you think about that, there's a little exchange in the chat box. Michael Hoppe offered that the idea of opportunistic was a good thing. Basically, it implies opportunity, and then Wendy Rose says, I wonder how and when and why the language has become corrupted. Opportunity is good, opportunistic equals bad, in the sense is somehow selfish and ruthless. I'll just offer a short answer to this. Bill, you might want to chime in. I think our work has been plagued a bit by language. Words mean different things to different people. We use them as shorthand. And somehow the early action logics have become somewhat disreputable. And I think it is partly because kind of a cookie cutter thing, higher is good, lower is bad. If you're really only functioning as an opportunist and you don't have any of these other action logics to rely on, then it becomes a little sociopathic. And I think it all boils down to oversimplification and the kind of ways we fall into stereotypical thinking. The labels have actually been changing somewhat, and Bill has put them into more of a verb form, and we've even tried to do that with the earlier ones. So opportunistic instead of opportunist. So in other words, you're not labeling the person, you're labeling the logic. And Patrick Sweet, who's on the call today, and I have had long conversations around the label of diplomat, because it's somewhat pejorative. It's like, oh, you're less than an expert, and you can see that's where we fall into trouble. And Patrick has the special problem that professionally he works with an audience of, okay, wait for it, diplomats, right? Actual diplomats, the real kind that help solve world problems. And they sense it as pejorative because, hey, look, it's like way down there on the ladder, and it implies a certain kind of simple-mindedness. And so in recent years, actually, Bill and I and John McGuire and Sarah Stawisky written a paper on the art and science of vertical development, in which we sort of point out the imbalances, the yin-yang kinds of imbalances in the field that lead to such kind of distortions. What do you think, Bill?
Yeah, well, we did choose the opportunist or opportunistic, diplomatic, expert, those names with the intention of having them be double meaninged, that yes, there is, America is the land of opportunity. Opportunists will be entrepreneurs and so forth. So, and my father was a diplomat, and I had a lot of, an official foreign service diplomat, and I had a tremendous respect for the work that he did. And so, I didn't think of the word diplomat as being so negative. But of course, if you have an attitude that the early action logics are primarily negative, then the word diplomat becomes negative. You know, the word expert is in general in very good esteem in modern technological society, but you know, but on the other hand, it can also imply narrow-mindedness and unwillingness to look outside of your particular schema. And all those things are also true about the early action logics. I think the key is to realize how much we each embody all the different action logics every day. And then you begin to realize that it's not a matter of having absolutely transcended the earlier action logics, but more likely that you can recognize as those action logics leap out of you, and sometimes they're perfectly appropriate. And you know, there's nothing wrong, as I say again and again, about being a diplomat when you drive. Better that than somebody that doesn't obey the rules of the road. So all of us are pretty extreme diplomats in our driving, and thank goodness for it. But let's go on to other questions or concerns. Oh, I might just interrupt you by saying that yes, we probably should have gone further in changing the names and talking about opportunistic. What we did change the later action logic names into adjectival or participle forms to indicate that at the later action logics, people are sort of moving through an action logic rather than wholly committed to it without being aware of being so wholly committed to it.
I was just going to comment on a post that Michael did a minute ago, where he was indicating that it's perhaps more useful to think in terms of earlier and later stages than higher and lower.
Absolutely. Yes, we've been trying to get people to talk that way about it for the last decade and a half. But there was a big, at the beginning, it was all lower and higher. Hard to get rid of that.
I have a question, and it'll demonstrate some ignorance, but I feel safe here. This notion of staging, this notion of action logics, I'm really comfortable with the notion of action logics. Less comfortable with the notion of staging, in terms of if I take reframing as something later. When I see children, I see them reframe all the time. Mm. I see them see things that I don't see. I see them see things that I see that I explain to them that they twist back around and hand back to me and leave me speechless. And in a logic that's kind of a reframing way, in a playful sense. And so it's been something I've sort of been curious about, Bill.
Yeah.
You know, do with that what you want. That's just sort of out there on the table for me.
Yeah, well, I think all the action logics appear as states in each of us at any age. You know, I had involuntary meditative states when I was quite young, just where, you know, everything in an otherwise unremarkable moment would seem to become suffused with meaning, is all I can say. You know, I was very aware of being there and didn't know what to do with that awareness. It only lasted a few seconds, but I think those might be called alchemical moments. And I agree with you that I don't like the stage notion, partly because, well, first of all, because it implies too much static nature to these action logics. And in particular, I think it misleads people about what the alchemical action logic is like, which in a way is a breakdown of all the action logics, is a more or less continual experience of yourself at different action logics. It doesn't feel that it ought to be called a stage at all, to me.
Yeah, I think.
Thank
Oh,
you
go
for
ahead.
that.
Yep.
No, just to thank you for that. That's all.
Yeah, we do indeed struggle with that, and it's quite clear to me that people can exhibit a range of action logics, right? And again, it seems like we're vastly oversimplifying things when we say, well, you're an expert, so you can do this, 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 and this. And I just roll my eyes because, it's not like that. The logic actually doesn't give you the competence. It just gives you the framework. And I think people exhibit a whole range, and it's captured in the theory because we say, well, there's a center of gravity. Yeah, so you might be centered in the expert logic. Hey, because guess what? You're an expert. You're a professional. It's what you do. You have to do this. You're required to be an expert. But that's just the center of gravity, and the idea that people, we've been discussing what's called fallback. And again, the oversimplification is fallback, like, hey, I'm an expert. And then like, without even knowing it, I slide down, or back into this opportunistic state. And it's embarrassing. It's not useful. And that's not satisfying to me. So that, like Bill said, that there's a range, like Bill, in your earlier story of diving into the creek, you found a range of logics. And Elaine Barker at Global Leadership Associates and Nancy Wallace, thank you. I've written a wonderful paper on imperfect beauty, in which they challenge some of the orderliness of the theory, and say, hey, look, on the other hand, it's messy. And that's what I mean by these yin yang complementarities. Adult development is both orderly and incredibly messy. And if you ignore the messy part, you lose a lot.
Can't hear you.
How about now? I
That's
put the
good.
mic by my mouth. See, my expertise deserted me when I needed it. Michael DePass has put a lovely little note into the chat, and for me, it highlights this tension between recognizing the central tendency that is sort of inherent in the idea of a stage, and recognizing the fluidity or spread that's inherent in the idea of seeing multiple action logics emerging often in the same experience. There is something about the damage that we do to that richness by focusing too much on the central tendency. And there's also something possibly that we do that's a damage to the possibility of development by simply saying, well, it's a smear. It's always a smear. So I wanted to offer that aspect.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I had experiences after knowing the theory and sort of being aware that I could apply it to my own life, of situations where trying to figure out what to do in the next meeting led me not only to review a sort of long history of whatever the project or organization was that I was engaged with at that point, but also found that the theory can really be fractal-like, and that between two stages of a larger process, you might be able to trace all the stages substages that lead from the one action logic to the next. And a couple of times I literally tried to figure out where I was, highly expert use of the theory, so to speak, but use it to then free my imagination for what was the right action for me to take at the next meeting. And in a couple of instances, even though it seems like kind of voodoo or something, it really worked. I did things which I never would otherwise have invented had I not thought in that way. So that's another way of understanding how developmental theory can be used in this more fractal-like manner.
So Michael's comment is says this discussion about blurring the boundaries between stages to me erodes the promise of evolving human development to create a more equitable and just world. I get it, and at a larger level, I want to work toward evolution to being able to be a more inclusive person and leader. Yeah, me too, Michael. You know, this is all sort of difficult. I'll tell you, one of the sensations I've had during my career is that I have just grown a lot more skeptical about the elevation of human beings. So when I was earlier in my career, I used to think like, wow, look at all these like really thoughtful people, you know, spiritual, well-grounded people. And then, you know, a lot of people have clay feet. This should not be surprising. So, you know, I just have to gird myself to be, you know, a little suspicious of claims of, you know, elevated consciousness. I mean, I too think that that's good. I mean, for me, I think a good answer is legitimizing human development and legitimizing the later stages. And that's a social thing. So one of the yin yang complementarities we talk about is individual collective. Yeah, there's a certain amount of work you can do on yourself, of course, you know, individuals can develop it, you know, society can develop. And so where I feel like we're doing some good is when we put these ideas out there of action logics at these later stages and legitimize them and make them more available to people so that they sort of infect people and seep in to shared consciousness. I had an experience working in the Middle East before the pandemic, and Bill, I think I've told you the story. Don't always get a chance to unpack the 7 logics, you know, because there's not time, yada, yada, but this group really wanted to. And so right before the session, I was thinking, like, how do I even talk about alchemist? And a lot of my colleagues at CCL have said, well, you know, can we just have 6 action logics? Because like this alchemical one, like, it's too woo-woo, you know, like we don't get it. We can't teach it. So let's just drop it. And I'm like, no, the struggle with it is important. And then I had this epiphany like, hey, I'm in the Middle East, alchemist. That's an Arabic term for, you know, the chemist. And if you just do a little bit of digging, you know, the Middle Eastern philosophy or Eastern philosophy has this notion of the philosopher king who's steeped in the mysteries of the universe. And that's a valid pursuit. And so I just felt good about being able to talk to these folks about like, look, you're being groomed as experts and achievers, honestly. And that's great. And that's going to be very rewarding. And I'm very happy for you. But I want you to just keep in the back of your mind that there's, you know, there's another sort of destination, and it's called alchemical, and it's part of your society, and you ought to lean into that. So I think just sort of teaching these things is a small victory in the direction you want to go, Michael. I hear you.
Yeah, it's helpful.
Mm-hmm. Well, look, it looks like we're drawing to the end of the time we allotted ourselves. And so maybe first just check in case there's somebody who's just been eager to say something and hasn't quite gotten in. Is there anybody that wants to get in? Nope, there's nobody that wants to get in. Okay, great. Well, we want to thank you for coming. And we have 3 more of these at about 3-month intervals. to look at different aspects of the book, and look forward to welcoming some of you again. And I hope you have a great summer now that, at least for some of us, COVID is slightly relenting, and we can turn our full attention to trying to keep the United States a democracy and a few other important issues. Lovely to be with you, and thank you for coming.
You're here, Bill. Thanks, everyone.